Hello there, Seamus.
Hi, Pierce. How's it going?
Not too bad. It seems we're not alone today.
We have a very special guest, Brett Scott, with us today. Hi, Brett. Would you like to talk a bit about yourself?
Hey guys, how you doing? Yeah, sure. I'm Brett Scott. I am originally from South Africa, but now live in London. Guess I'm known for writing about the financial sector and monetary systems and alternative finance and financial activism. I put a book out a few years ago called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money.
That's a grabbing title anyway.
Yeah. It's that came out 2013. And enjoy. I kind of I'm freelance, so I kind of do lots of different pieces of work, but it's always something related to like exploring the financial system, exploring monetary systems, working with groups, doing alternative currencies, alternative banking systems, and so on. And like, I guess more recently, I've been looking a lot at the intersection of finance and technology, which includes a bunch of stuff around like digital finance, but also like, crypto stuff, blockchain technology. And I've been writing quite a bit about the dynamics of cashless society. So that's been some kind of, I'm one of the commentators in that space, I guess.
That's actually how I came into contact with you, Brett. It was I was reading an article you wrote in The Guardian, and it came up about the cashless society, and I had never ever thought of it. Before that, I was one of the people who was like, yeah, cashless society. That's a great idea. You know what I mean? I don't have to carry around all this, primitive money in my pockets just weighing me down. It seems like it's only advantageous to move forward into a cashless society, but you had a completely different stance on that.
Yeah, and it's actually it's quite an interesting area because it touches on two kind of things that like a lot of finance stuff, a lot of people find very like confusing and a bit like mysterious. But everybody has everyday experience of payment systems. So a lot of people actually have opinions on it, more so than they have opinions on, say, like investment banking or like complex finance. So it's an interesting area to like write about because a lot of people want to like chime in and give their opinions. But also it kind of like taps into the broader stuff around technology because actually a lot of the issues you find in like cashless society debates you find it's part of like a broader debate in society around essentially around automation and digitization of everything. So there's lots of like interesting technology elements to the question or technology philosophy.
For our audience, why in a few simple sentences do you think that a cashless society is a bad idea?
First of all, it's probably important to like clarify what the term could mean to different people. When I'm talking about a cashless society, I'm essentially referring to a society in which you're forced to use digital payments. Mm-hmm. Okay. And a lot of people, when they're using the term cashless, are kind of using it to mean something slightly different. Like people say, hey, I'm doing cashless payment, by which they mean I'm doing digital payment. Okay. But like right now in our society, we actually have a combination of digital payment systems and cash. All right. So like those two can actually coexist. So what we're really saying with a cashless society is when you remove one of those options, all right, so you essentially get rid of one of the ways you can do payment, mm-hmm. and you basically make sure everybody uses digital payment. So in a sense, like I'm not like attacking digital payment in and of itself. I'm attacking the removal or like the forcing people to use digital payment. right? And so like the basic like reasons why people should think twice about that, there's a few different like critiques. One of them is around surveillance, around the fact that in essence, when you move to digital payment systems, you always have to go through intermediaries who can watch what you're doing. Okay. Like the second like body of critique is around financial inclusion, which basically means like people who can't get access to digital payment systems currently actually rely on the cash system. And as soon as you try to like force people onto digital payments, you can start to exclude people who don't easily get access to digital systems. And then there's like other sort of areas of concern, like cybersecurity, resilience of your payment system, and there's various like legal questions too, and like monetary policy questions, which we could, like elaborate upon.
Yeah, one of the more interesting parts about the article I found was that your perspective that the banks were doing it almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but almost malevolently, like to try and get profit from this move to cashless society, as you said, to charge on every card transaction to make profit off getting rid of money.
I mean, you don't have to see it as a conspiracy.
No.
It's like I think some people like interpret it as if I was arguing that there's some kind of malevolent, like gathering of some kind of Illuminati who are trying to get rid of cash. and actually in conspiracy circles, you do find that belief. All right. Like there are like a lot of like, sort of, conspiratorial, like people who believe that like there's a big like push going on, like that's coordinated. But you don't need a conspiracy to be able to like understand this. Like basically large corporations, financial corporations, are competing on markets and they're trying to optimize their profits. All right. Like they're trying to like cut costs and boost their returns. For a lot of those players, it makes sense for them to try and do that through automation. Okay. So they try to basically cut out non-automated parts of their operation and get people to move onto their digital systems because they cut costs in that way. So like the basic like commercial impulse from large institutions is all that they want to automate things. Okay. Now that doesn't mean they're going to like do that overnight or that they all like engaged in a vast conspiracy about it. It's just like it's like a tendency within these corporate systems. Okay. But that said, like that said, there's actually been, when you start to like dig down into this issue, you start to really see like a whole like lobbying infrastructure, a whole kind of like power infrastructure, which has been over the last like 20 years slowly eroding the cash system. And like just to put this in context, one of the reasons why I've been writing these articles is that the traditional story told about cashless society is that it's driven from the bottom up. It's like, oh, it's just what consumers want. It's what all these like, it's just some kind of like natural progress, which sort of is like happens by itself.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not saying there aren't elements of that occur, but like what's really occurring is that like, or the big sort of missing part of that story is that there's very particular commercial and state interests who really want cashless society to happen and are actively pushing for it. And they're sometimes pushing on an open door. Okay, so there are some people who are like totally fine with that. They're like, oh, cool, yeah, we accept this new digital systems. But then they're kind of like trying to find ways to actively get people who are not into that to sort of nudge them onto these digital systems and to try and like push them onto these systems. And yeah, so that's kind of like what I'm trying to highlight.
So, Brett, I am curious to hear where you think cryptocurrencies fit in here. Obviously, the obvious ones are surveillance, would be one obvious reason to use cryptocurrencies. They're very useful for preventing surveillance. But I was just thinking in terms of financial inclusion or cutting out automated parts of the economy, it seems that cryptocurrencies will affect the same things that a normal cashless society would. It seems like it would isolate and perhaps even isolate even more people, as those technologies are less mainstream than, say, just Visa debit cards.
Look, point one, every single time I write an article about cashless society, I get a whole bunch of crypto people who shout at me and say, "Oh, but don't you realize this problem's been solved by crypto already?" Fear not, we've already solved this problem.
Yeah, it's like if you're worried about anonymity, we have a coin for that. We've Monero or whatever,
Yeah. So there's this whole kind of thing, and look, I'm not saying there's not useful elements of crypto, but it's very, very far from providing a viable solution to this right now. I mean, it's important to there is a big connection between crypto and this topic, though, because actually some of the original elements of a cryptocurrency experimentation, or like cryptocurrency is like a bunch of different sort of things put together that were designed from the 1980s, 1990s, and all kind of sort of came together into cryptocurrency. But some of the earlier predecessors were things like DigiCash and stuff. There was a guy, this guy David Chaum, who I think back in 1983 or so was writing, and he was a cryptographer, and he saw the potential for large-scale surveillance of payments that could occur in a society where you were increasingly operating on the internet and were increasingly subject to these third parties, right? So and he wrote a paper which was called Blind Signatures for Untraceable Payments, which is kind of like a sort of classic of crypto mythology, where he was basically just saying, hey, as people use digital payment systems, their time of transaction, their place of transaction, what they're buying is all going to be visible to large institutions. All right. We need to develop an untraceable form of digital payments that will stop that from happening and be able to maintain privacy. And he was part of what's called the cypherpunk movement. So these kind of crypto anarchists who believe that in the age of the internet, you're really going to need a digital payment system that preserves privacy, right? So in many ways, the cryptocurrency community was predicting this problem. The main, having said that, though, it's not like Bitcoin has actually solved the problem, right? So it's but it's important to recognize that at least one part of the roots of crypto do come from a recognition of shit. We don't want surveillance of payments.
Yeah.
Right.
But there's many reasons why crypto doesn't actually solve the problem right now. Again, like any digital system, it relies on people having access to the technology and having access to, stable internet connections and all that kind of stuff, having technological literacy and so on. But also the system is just too small to deal with the sheer amount of transactions that go on in an economy. It has massive scaling problems. So even if it was to able to get over the technological literacy problem, it has all the other problems, and then it doesn't really even operate like money. So there's a whole kind of problem about whether it really can be considered an actual currency right now.
Well, in a lot of ways, it operates more like stocks, right, than money. It operates more like a commodity than an actual fiat currency.
Yeah, I mean, what it is, it's a digital token. Right. That's all it is. Something being a digital token doesn't make it money.
But Brett, in fairness, I think what our currency is based off at the moment is nothing. I think euros is based off maybe some oil backed a little bit, but it's mostly say for the US dollar, it's not gold backed anymore. It just has the value that is placed on it by people, and it's similar. Even though it's digital, it still has a similar, I don't know, value just because people place on it. I know it's completely arbitrary, but it's the same.
No. I mean, like, I would disagree. I mean, like, you're opening up a whole like monetary policy rabbit hole with that thing. But like, let me just say, like, what you just said is a very, very, very common line that people all say.
Okay, correct me, please.
So you're not alone in making that statement you just made.
Okay.
All right. But like the issue is like far, far more complex than that. Like, and this is actually something that crypto people often say. They're like, oh yeah, but all currency is just like invented. All right. All currency is just like that. And it's like, this is not exactly the case. All right. So, first of all, like modern credit-based money systems have explicit like anchor points. And I don't want to like, I don't know how like deep you want to go into this, yeah, but like, they. Let me give you like an analogy for this. Okay, like this, I've got a good analogy for how to explain this. Okay, like think about a train system. Okay. Like, right. Think about a train ticket. Like, a train ticket is a token. All right. You can hold it in your hand. You can pass it to somebody else if you want. You can transfer it around. You can even have a digital train ticket if you want. All right. It's like a token. But that ticket is completely meaningless unless there's an underlying train system which actually gives it some kind of power. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So like this is like the difference between a token and the thing that makes the token work. If you found that train ticket on an alien planet that didn't have a train system, it would simply be a piece of cardboard. Okay. Right. Now, similarly, if you find, for example, a US dollar banknote on an alien planet that doesn't have a monetary system, it's just a piece of paper, right? But in the context of the U.S. economy and like political system, that isn't just a piece of paper. That's an actual credit issued by the U.S. government. It's redeemable for taxes, and it's also locked into a gigantic network of production. All right, you can like wander around the USA and like shout to people and say, "Hey, don't you all realize that this token is meaningless?" People are not going to give a shit.
Yeah, right. Give it to me then.
Yeah, they're going to be like, actually, in the context of our economy, that token is the only thing we can use to essentially gain access to the products of other people's labor.
So, but essentially, the only pitfall or the only difference then is really that you can purchase tangible things with fiat currencies, but not with cryptocurrencies. But there is like, that's just a question of progress, and there is some places you can.
Yeah, sure, but if you wanna kickstart a currency circuit, it really helps if you have anchoring institutions.
But right. Okay, so I think Brett, where I'm finding like trouble with your argument about the digital currencies, if say for instance, and the move to cryptos is like, it's like some sort of, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but like a digital Luddite in a way. It's like the progress as it's being made will self-serve itself, and the concerns about anonymity and other concerns would be serviced by specific aspects of cryptocurrency, and then could be used to buy tangible things too. Is that not correct? Or?
I mean, that's more like a kind of statement of faith than an actual kind of like sort of holistic assessment of the situation.
I suppose when actual money was invented as well, people could have been saying that. It's like, no, I don't want to give you this piece of paper instead of, a rug for my bread or whatever. When barter stopped existing and actual money started to, like, I know gold had value because it was shiny and you could use it as a good conductor or whatever, but when actual money started to come in, people have faith in that too.
Well, I think personally, I would suspect it's a question of inertia. I mean, it really does help that, say, the US dollar is backed by a formidable and ginormous economy. And I think it could just be a question of time. But that there's definitely something to be said for that kind of inertia. But Brett, I'm curious to get your opinions on. You mentioned you were from South Africa originally. I'm curious to get your opinions on how Africa as a whole has kind of dealt with these banking systems and the turn towards digital systems, because as I understand it, a lot of banking in Africa is just run through phone networks rather than, specifically the internet or through banks themselves. I think it's only 30% of Africans have access to an actual bank. So I'm just curious to get your general opinion on that.
Sure. I mean, maybe just for the purposes of like categorization here for like anybody listening, because it gets very easy to start to like mix all these issues up. Mm-hmm. So like the issue around cashless society with fiat money systems is the question about whether you want to completely make your fiat money system completely digital, or whether you want to maintain a non-digital way of doing transactions using fiat money. All right. Like that can be conceptually separated from the cryptocurrency question, which is totally digital, which is competing with fiat currency in general, right? Both cash and digital fiat money, right? So like those two issues must be separated from the very beginning. And you can have a whole debate about whether you prefer fiat money implemented in digital form or in a combination of digital and non-digital form. But that's kind of like, like separated out from the crypto stuff. In the case of African countries, I mean, the country that has the most uptake of mobile phone-based systems has been Kenya. And various other East African countries, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda. East Africa has been quite a big hub for experimentation around the use of mobile phone-based systems. Okay, like the most prevalent, the most well-known example is the M-Pesa system, which essentially like recognized it's like, hey, like everybody, most like say small traders and like people in the informal economy in like Nairobi, for example, have mobile phones. All right, but they might not have bank accounts. And if I'm a mobile phone operator that has everyone's SIM details and stuff, I'm essentially operating like a ledger where I can like, I already have like a database of their interactions. So why don't we like tack on a money system onto that, like a database-based money system? So like you can start to move credits around using your phones, using text messages. And that was very successful. It is backed by banks. So like in the end, it goes back into the banking system, but it's sort of on the surface is operated by a telecoms company. So like that's one of the reasons why places like Kenya have been seen as like good kind of test beds for other digital systems, including crypto stuff. But it doesn't mean. I mean, I've got a good friend in Kenya who's very concerned, for example, about the surveillance implications of M-Pesa systems. And he's trying to work on how you would deal with that, because you have a huge number of Kenyans who are now becoming reliant on a single company to facilitate all the transactions in the economy. Right? If that company goes down, I mean, not only is there surveillance implications, but if the company has some kind of like problem and it has systems failure, your whole economy collapses. Like this happened in the UK like a few weeks ago when the Visa network went down.
Yeah.
And suddenly all these people were like, oh, crap. And it's like, yeah, it's only convenient until you have a systems failure. Okay. And actually, security people understand this. So it's not like necessarily like a Luddite thing. It's like, if you're a person who's in charge of like making sure like your national security, and you ask yourself the question, do you want every single transaction in your economy going through like 2 or 3 players? It's not obvious that you really do want that. If you put yourself at huge risk if you suddenly have these single points of failure that can go down. So, I mean, I've probably deviated from the original question about African countries.
Well, no, I guess you pointed out there that system doesn't really solve any of the problems you've raised already. It's still reliant on central nodes. Yeah.
I mean, look, in the case of Kenya, I mean, as I said, I'm not trying to argue that digital payment systems don't have benefits. All right. What I'm saying is that it's not good to get rid of non-digital payments options. Yeah.
Right.
Which is a different thing, right? People often try to conflate those two things to say that they're the same. I mean, for example, in Kenya, if you're a small roadside trader, there's lots of this kind of like informal trading that goes on. If you're like selling various like goods on the street, maybe you have to source your goods from somewhere that's like 20 kilometers away. All right. And if you're having to pay in cash, like, you know, maybe you have to send somebody with cash to go and like pay for it, and you have to bring those goods back and all this kind of stuff, and you maybe don't know if you're going to sell them and all this kind of thing. So actually, like, some of those digital systems are very useful for a small trader to be like, hey, you know, like I'll take your goods on consignment, and then like later in the day I'll like transfer credit to you and this kind of thing. So like, don't get me wrong, there's definitely like benefits. But it's a lot of hidden implications if you then use that to prevent people from using non-digital payment systems.
Yeah. You said something earlier as well, Brett, just to move on, about why you said it'd be beneficial to the banking system, but also to the government for a cashless society. Why would it be better for the government if the society was cashless?
I mean, look, the government's not like a monolithic entity that has a single will, right? There's different departments who have different agendas within state institutions. The departments that I've just come across who've been the most sort of keen on cashless society have been tax authorities. Okay. All right. Obviously, if all your transactions go through a third party digital payment system provider, you can basically like see what people spend money on, and you can see their income and you can see their expenses, and you can basically do like almost like automatic tax assessment. All right. So, and they've long viewed the cash as being a kind of like a black hole in the system because it's offline, essentially. All right. So tax authorities, national security people sometimes who are concerned about like terrorist financing and like money laundering, because again, you can see the stuff more. And then there's like central banking people. This is not like unanimous in the central banking community, but people believe that cash prevents certain forms of monetary policy. In particular, it prevents negative interest rates, which basically means that like if banks lower their interest rates below zero, people will generally try to take their money out of the banks and convert it into cash, because cash can't go minus, essentially, right? Like you can't like remotely erode it away.
Right. Yeah. You can't have a deficit of paper.
Yeah. Like a negative interest would almost be like, you know, if you try to like imagine it in the cash form, it would be like the paper slowly disintegrating away. Yeah. But like you can't like remotely initiate that. Like you can with digital payments. So like, for example, if the central bank says we want to put negative interest rates because we think it'll make people, because we want to try and make people spend more, so it puts negative interest rates on the bank reserves, and then the banks themselves try to like push those negative interest rates onto ordinary people who have accounts with them. People are going to be like, wait a moment, why do we have our money in the bank account? Like, let's just take it out, right? So central bankers and people, like some of them would say, hey, if we got rid of cash, people would be forced to keep their money in the form of bank deposits, which means we could implement negative interest rates to make them spend. Okay. Which is controversial.
Yeah, that's interesting.
For a whole other reason. So Brett, I'm interested then to see if, in your opinion, the worst case scenario happens and we do move to a cashless society. Like, what kind of time frame are we looking at there? I know you've said for the last 20 years they've been trying to do it, but how long do you think it would take to go from our current situation now to a virtually cashless society?
I mean, it's I don't think it's like inevitable. You know, like hey, if you hang out in the technology community, of course, or any like innovation community, they always have a story which is like technological change is inevitable and you can't stop it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sensational.
Like, and that's part of like how you market products in the the tech sector in general. All right. So like anything about, and so like this has been like any like futurist, any sort of like uncritical futurist has been saying, oh, cash is on its way out. You know, they've been saying it for the last like 15 years or whatever. Like, and they're going to carry on saying it, right? Because it's a part of the standard story of all tech futurists. But like actually, people, there are like an increasing like wave of people who are getting concerned, right? So like, you know, on average, if you go up to the sort of the everyday person and you ask them, how are you concerned about this? They tend to be like a bit like indifferent. They're like, well, yeah, it's like, yeah, it seems fine. But like, as soon as you get political movements that start to rally people and say, hey, do you realize what the implications of this are? You could actually have backlashes, all right? And actually, I've seen this among, say, central bankers and various state officials who are actually like slightly concerned about what public perceptions will be if they start to force this issue too much, all right? And bear in mind that, like, despite like, you know, people love to like slag off state authorities as being, you know, corrupt and like, you know, useless and so on. But the one thing you can say about state authorities is that they generally have to pay a little bit more attention to public perceptions, and they at least have to sort of maintain like a kind of like story about thinking about the broader implications of things. All right. Which is like simply not the case in financial corporations. Like Visa, for example, Visa overtly does not give a shit about the implications of they overtly say it. They have absolutely no interest in showing people what the implications of cashless society are. Visa has an internal department whose job it is to essentially like create propaganda about cash. And they overtly state it. All right? And this is because Visa makes money from it. They have a profit incentive to basically just like convince everybody to do this. Whereas like, you know, some guy sitting at the Swedish central bank, you know, like it doesn't really have the same profit incentive to like make people like want this thing. And they probably have like a little bit more leeway to be like, well, actually, maybe we should like think about like the different things. And even if you're cynical about state authorities, like go and actually spend some time speaking to some of these guys, and they don't have a unanimous view on it at all. But like the fintech industry certainly does have a unanimous view in general. Like they overtly say it like all the time.
More money.
Yeah. So I don't know. So I think you could see some backlashes, but also that like I think the state, I think things that would create policy or like concern would be, one, the financial inclusion element, being like, hey, we're a bit concerned that actually like, for example, homeless people will start to get excluded from economic activity, or like refugees and that kind of thing. Then there's a concern about like worrying people about privacy. And there's another concern. Oh, yeah, security. I think they're like, you know, I think when the Visa network went down in the UK, I think it was like a little moment of pause for like some national security people being like, whoa, didn't really think of that one before.
Is our money gone?
Yeah, I suppose I'd never consider that either. But there are a lot of things that you wouldn't consider that are national security concerns, and I suppose financial infrastructure should be perhaps one of the biggest ones.
One of the things, what they really want is they don't want central points of failure, right? Like, and this is like maybe like quite future looking, but if you hypothetically imagine a completely cashless society, which is relying on quasi-monopolistic, or at least an oligopoly of payments providers, because they thrive on network effects, right? You know, Visa and MasterCard rely on network effects. It's like they have to coordinate all these banks. It doesn't make sense to have like 120 different payments networks. Like, And if you suddenly have that, like you're opening up a big potential like vector for attack vector for like, let's say you like, I don't know, in your quintessential like bogeyman, I don't know, like the Russian cyber hacker or whatever. Like you take the systems down, you can freeze entire economies.
Yeah.
And that's pretty big, you know. And I don't think like you should get alarmist about it, but it's definitely going to be something that like national security people are thinking about right now.
On the flip side, Brett, do you see any positive aspects from a cashless society? Maybe like one that comes to mind straight away for me is like, I don't know, probably less crime, way less crime, or like crime more easily stopped or something like that.
Like the question around the crime is quite complicated, actually. Let me give you this like anecdote from my personal experience. Like in the USA right now, a bunch of states have legalized marijuana, okay, including California. I took part in an event in the US in Oakland, California, a few like last year sometime, which was called the Crypto Cannabis Salon. All right. And basically the deal was like that cannabis businesses in California are legal businesses now.
Yeah.
All right. But banking is federally regulated in the US. All right. So while it's legal on a state level, banks aren't easily able to do business with legal cannabis businesses in California because they're concerned about getting hit at a federal level for like money laundering charges and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, a lot of the Californian legal cannabis industry has to use cash, right? Now, a lot of them are angry about that because they're like, hey, we're modern businesses. We're like legitimate business people. We should be allowed to use modern digital payment systems, right? And so they've become more like anti-cash because they're like, we've been excluded from getting this new thing, right? And I remember being there and saying to these guys, it's like, do you realize that the only reason you've managed to get your industry in a position to even be legalized was the fact that cash supported you in all those years, right? Like, if you had had a pure digital payment system back in the 1950s, you wouldn't have a legal weed industry now.
No.
All right. So like this is the thing about like social progress is that like a lot of stuff that's originally considered criminal later gets recognized as legal. So for example, like homosexuality or like political activism was often considered illegal in many places. All right. But it's like, and in those situations, what would happen is people would go underground and use the cash economy to survive, essentially, to stay active up to the point where they can get themselves recognized as a legal activity.
Yeah.
So the question you want to ask yourself is, okay, fine, maybe you're going to like combat crime by like
what benefit will that have for society? Yeah.
Yeah, but are you going to simultaneously potentially like freeze social progress?
Yeah.
And it's a complicated argument, right? Because it's like, who knows? I mean, what would probably actually happen is it would force a flourishing of, if you did have to actually like suddenly force people to use digital payment systems, it would probably force like a flourishing of cryptocurrency and like black market digital currency systems to deal with the need for those kind of like deviant illicit activities.
Yeah.
And actually, that's like going back to the national security question. Interestingly, like one of the things that national security people are concerned about is it's like, if we did actually have to force, like get rid of cash, would it cause a proliferation of like dark market activity? You know, as people get forced onto these like internet's like based systems rather than using the original like cash, you know, the street dealer who's, you know, dealing weed and, you know, wherever. So it's complex. You
can't bust into someone's apartment and they've already just like smashed up their memory stick, like as opposed to having piles of cash at the table, right?
Yeah. So like, you know, the story about the crime and stuff is like often touted as being like an obvious benefit, but I think it's far more murky than people make out. And it's the question is like, do you really like? While none of us like crime, what would a society that has absolutely no space for
to breathe,
like gray activity, like what would that society feel like, or like what would it be like? Do you really want that society? Like it's an interesting philosophical question.
Yeah, that's such a great point, bro. I hadn't even thought of that. Like, it's very Orwellian, like, to just completely like surveilled. Like, I was thinking, you know, for the benefits of like you say, people passing money for different crimes, or say for human trafficking or something like that. But at the same time, you are stopping that social progress that you spoke about, you know. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think one of the important things to also bear in mind here is that like the political structure in your country makes a difference. Like one of the reasons why, let's say, Sweden has quite high levels of cashlessness, or like is basically heading towards a cashless society, is partly because the population in Sweden has very high levels of trust in their institutions and a very strong underlying institutional structure that people have no real problem with. All right. So they're like, if you go up to the average Swede and you say, do you trust that the central bank and the state is like basically legitimate? Most of them say, yes, we think these are well-run institutions, and, you know, they might have some like minor gripes, but they're basically on average have like high levels of trust in their society, and they've got extremely high levels of like technology, education, healthcare, all this kind of stuff, right? And in that type of context, people might actually be like a little bit more trusting that there's not going to be abuse. But like you suddenly go to, for example, I don't know, like pick any number of countries where like political processes are more opaque and like violence is more prevalent. Like, and you really want to then ask yourself, like, do you want
that in the hands of them?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people in those countries are a bit skeptical. Like,
and rightly so.
Yeah, and you find some really weird like cultural elements. Like in Germany, for example, a lot of people are very pro cash, which is related to some kind of like I think it was related to like the hyperinflations and stuff of the 1920s or 30s. Like there's a sort of sense that you don't want your money in the banks necessarily. Like
if I have it, it's tangible and they can't take it away from me. Like,
yeah, it's an interesting. People have probably done studies on this about like who sort of like culturally resonates with cash. And actually, there's an interesting another element to this, which is like. If you're looking at gentrification processes in society, like when there's a lot of cities are experiencing gentrification right now, one of the things that gentrification is associated with is digital payment systems. So like if you rock up in New York and you go to all like the hipster places, what do they all have? They all have a little like square, like the little like white square, the company, the payments company, there's digital payment systems, and they often refuse to accept cash, right? Yeah. So there's this whole like sense of like digital payment systems are like a little bit like the gentrification of payment, you know, and it's associated with these types of people who really do that. And like cash, on the other hand, seems to like be most readily recognized as like unproblematic in more like less formal environments.
Yeah. And I think as well, it's really interesting to maybe even think about like the psychological impact of like having a cashless society too, and the fact that people tend to spend more pretty much if they pay by card a lot of the time, especially because tapping it's so accessible to just tap.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there are real studies on that now, and that's actually like a legitimate research field is, and I have seen research. Which does suggest that it increases spending. Obviously, it's probably like early days to actually be able to like tell. Single research pieces don't necessarily like prove something, but like certainly the research that's been done has suggested that there is like a correlation between increases in spending. And the sort of intangible nature of the payments experience with digital, and you might want to like use the analogy. If you think about like internet-based shopping, if you're trying to like buy stuff on like eBay or something,
just 12
there's like a different
come up, yeah.
There's a different psychological experience to if you like walk into a store and you like hold things and you experience them, right? So there's like a slightly more like detached and kind of like surreal experience when you're in the digital realm, and it's possible that like this is like an element of people don't really like conceptualize themselves doing stuff. They're just like tapping away, and it's kind of like and they don't really realize. But who knows?
Exactly, and it just kind of goes out of control. It's the tangibility once again, like.
But I mean, then again, like I mean, it's entirely possible that people develop new cultural responses to this and try to like and figure out how to deal with it. It's not like we don't have the ability to adapt to systems. But I really can't stand the completely uncritical attitude that so many people have towards these things. It's like I really think the debate needs to be balanced out, and like counter arguments need to be addressed, because the debate in the UK especially has been completely dominated by the sort of financial technology industry and these kind of like innovation pundits who just like celebrate digitization as obviously being positive.
Yeah, another point to make is also, it was in your article about shutting branches and shutting ATMs. Like that's loss of work, and for people, like people are continually losing their jobs as cashless society goes. So even in supermarkets, it's all just ATMs now, or just self-service checkouts.
Yeah, I mean, I did it in Ireland. Has it been experiencing that too, or was that?
Yeah, to less extent than
a lot of Ireland would be like relatively similar to the UK in terms of penetration of those technologies. I think I'm less in alignment with you on that, though. I think that kind of automation is just going to come anyway. I know you said technological advancement isn't necessarily inevitable, but I feel like those kind of self-service desks and stuff might be inevitable, just because the technology is so easy to produce now and so efficient.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, you gotta imagine the internal boardroom meetings in these large companies, right? Like,
you say for 20 cents of electricity, we can get the pay of 10 employees. Okay, yeah, we'll.
Yeah, in the case of self-service checkouts, I'm gonna speculate on how they think. I'm imagining what they say. They're like, okay, it costs us X amount to buy these machines. We're going to lose a certain amount through increased levels of shoplifting, because it's easier to shoplift because some people like game those machines.
Yeah.
But what we lose through that, we're going to gain through the fact that we can start to lay off all our front office staff, or at least reduce them, and the increased throughput on our systems. And they've done the calculations and they've worked out that these are good investments. There's a bunch of glitches probably, like maybe the machines break down all the time. Maybe the technology's not advanced enough yet. But like the basic impulse is like, at some point, we want to basically push people onto these systems because like it's gonna cut costs for us. And then their job is basically like, how do we slowly convince people to make sure we use these? And then they're gonna have to keep like a few cashiers there, because there's gonna be the person who's like, like possibly like elderly people. You see, they often still use cashiers because they like feel less confident with those machines. And then like, but basically like they're going to try and like push people off those non-digital systems. And like, it's not that like, capitalist businesses don't only have to make profit. It's like, how do you make the most profit, right? So if you've got a bunch of shareholders sitting there, and you can be a bank and you can run a branch network and you can still be profitable. Like, you can still make money by having all these physical branches, but your investors are going to be saying, but hey, are we getting the best return on investment? Wouldn't we make higher profit margins if we got rid of those branches and basically force everyone to digital systems? So it's like, they're like probably thinking to themselves, yeah, like on net, like, fuck it, just like start to like push people out of those branches, start to like, and they're probably thinking to themselves as well, if we lose customers, who cares? Because on average, we're going to be making more profit.
Yeah, we'll get more customers in.
And really the customers don't have much choice either. because there's not like as many options.
True. So
it's like
I think like a good place to like maybe move on the discussion to its final point would be asking you where you consider the best point in the cashless equilibrium. Where would that be? Whether, like, what point in history? Completely cash society, completely cashless, half and half is now the perfect point, was like 10 years ago.
Interesting question. Like, I guess, let me make a point that goes slightly against what I've been saying.
We love hypocrites.
So like my main argument so far has been that there is a collection of banks and state entities that want cashless society to happen, and they slowly want to basically wean people off cash and push you onto digital systems, right? To some extent, they're pushing on an open door, okay? Or maybe not. And then they have to convince everybody who's kind of like, who's not into it, so they slowly have to nudge them off, okay? But let's like hypothetically say that actually you didn't even need these entities pushing. People just like wanted this kind of stuff, okay? One of the main problems we have right now in technology-based activism, because I'm involved in lots of like technology, like activist styles of groups, is in general, like, and this is a problem in like capitalist systems more generally, is that like individual people are very good at recognizing short-term narrow benefits, but very, very bad at like being able to act upon long-term collective problems. All right. So in the short term, a lot of people do actually say, "Oh, well, you know, who cares? I mean, I'll just use digital instead of cash. It's more short-term convenient for me." And every individual person doing that is like, "Oh, cool," you know. But then, like, in so doing, we all lock ourselves into some long-term collective dependence upon these systems that aren't necessarily in our best interest. Like a very classic example of this is like smartphones. You know, like we've all essentially become addicted to smartphones because they were like kind of like in our short-term interest, but now we're suddenly all subject to surveillance and we're all subject to forms of control we previously never were. All right. And the question is, if you're a technology activist, is to say like, how do you get across that, or like how do you deal with that? Because how do you like form political movements to say, hey, shit, even though we understand some of these technologies are in your short-term interest, can we all get together, please, and like make decisions about whether it's like collectively in everybody's interest in the long term? And that's extremely hard to do because like politically, like it's very difficult. So this is like a long way of saying, like, I don't really know what the optimal balance between cash and digital payments is. And I'm guessing, like,
if there was no transition period, if there was no place where we had to him and haw, where everybody was forced into it, would a cashless society that offered, like, security and anonymity be the best solution? Or do you think this society always needs cash?
I think the like analogy I would draw upon was one I draw upon a lot is with transportation systems. Okay. Like in modern transportation systems, we have multiple modes of transport. Cars, bicycles, trains, and most people use one or more of those, like more than the others, all right? But they will sporadically use like, you know, like other things. Like, and this is like a good analogy because it's like, if you're in an environment that only has bicycles, for example, right? there's like nobody has cars. The introduction of cars is initially seen as a very good thing. People are like very excited. They're like, oh, cool, this thing drives much further. It's like much faster. It's much more convenient. I can carry more stuff, right? You have this whole system that emerges, all right? But if you suddenly have a system which is like, you have to use cars and you cannot use bicycles, that's actually like, a lot of people don't like that.
Yeah.
A lot of people will still want to keep a bicycle in the back room for when they want to go for a short little trip down to the store kind of thing, right? So like, I think it's like a decent analogy because like, while it's true that like most people will be using cars, they still like retain that like sort of option to use a different form of transportation. And weirdly enough, like if you look at the history of transportation, like a lot of problems that were caused by cars, like congestion, pollution, huge traffic jams, like urban sprawl, people are now turning towards bicycles to try and fix. All right, people ride on bicycles rather than cars because it's quicker. All right. So that, I mean, I'm kind of like pitching that like maybe this is like going to be something that we will see in the future of payment systems. Like, it is possible you're going to see like cultural trends or social change where people actually return back to non-digital forms of interaction. But I don't know.
An underground cash movement. People,
yeah.
The people make their own cash and trade it.
I wouldn't underestimate it.
No, there's even a place over here in London like in Brixton they have their own cash and you can spend it in certain shops and supports the community. It's really
I'm on the advisory group of the Brixton Pound.
Well, look who I'm talking to.
Yeah. Actually, interestingly, Brixton Pound is mostly digital. All right. The cash notes in the Brixton Pound system, which is a local currency, are mostly there as a kind of like branding operation, right?
Yeah,
because photojournalists don't know how to take photos of digital money, so that photojournalists need, if you're promoting something, you need these physical artifacts. But actually, most of the Brixton Pound transactions are done via a message-based system, a bit like M-Pesa would be, like, and actually. That's how it operates. But then this is operating at a very different scale, right? Like the Brixton Pound is a community currency, and the whole point is to bring people together and to sort of like showcase, like getting to meet each other. So there's like privacy implications are like it's like very different in a small scale community than if you're on like some like large scale nation state.
Right. And well, I suppose those kind of small scale solutions, there's a lot to be said for those. We tend to think in terms of entire economies when we're talking about this kind of thing, but it's easy to forget that there are internal systems within economies, and those internal systems can have their own solutions to these problems.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. And a lot of the questions around currency design is around what scale you wanted to operate on, and what the optimal scale of a currency is. And like, you guys are now, part of the Euro system, and this is part of what the big questions are in the politics of the euro. You sacrifice certain things and gain certain things by increasing the scale of a currency. So like you gain access to a whole trade network, but maybe you lose autonomy, and then this is a similar dynamic going on with, say, like local currency systems. They're like, say, something like the Brixton Pound, for example, operating at a super small scale, like local scale, and they say like, well, we gain autonomy like this, but we obviously now lose access to it's a much smaller network. So this is like one of the sort of currency questions, is like, what's the best scale that you want your currencies to operate on? Cryptocurrency tries to go like global.
Right.
This is one of the reasons why it's so hard for anybody to make decisions about it, because there's no governance structure. So like nobody has any idea, like, if you like want to change the code, who to ask. This is one of the cause for all the big battles internal to the crypto community. There's no like political system to like make decisions about it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think that's a lovely time to tie it off. And thank you so much, Brett. Really interesting topics.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brett.
I hope I didn't talk too much, but
no, we like that.
Exactly the correct amount.
All right, cool.
At the end of the day, it's 9.
If you're sick, you won't be well.
Thanks very much, now, guys. Talk to you.